Hello, and welcome to another vlog. I have a very busy weekend coming up, as I will be leaving for Winnipeg tomorrow to attend the Council of Canadians with Disabilities annual general meeting. And then on June 27th, I've actually been asked to attend the graduation at Parkview Education Centre, my old high school, where I will be the guest speaker. So I'll talk a little bit about some of my accomplishments and my advocacy work and some of the things that I've learned from all of those activities. But today I want to talk about something a little bit more serious. Specifically, I want to talk about the underrepresentation of people with disabilities. Um, Now, when I say that people with disabilities are underrepresented, what I mean is that they're often excluded from every aspect of society. So not only are people with disabilities often misrepresented in government and in the media, but they don't always have fair access to things like education, employment, or housing. Um, and, be, and this is a problem because of this, people with disabilities are often looked down upon by society, um, and often overlooked by society altogether. And it's kind of a vicious cycle where a lot of this overlooking people with disabilities leads to more neglect of people with disabilities and more exclusion. And I specifically want to talk about the exclusion of people with disabilities when it comes to human rights movements. Um, this is something that I'm very passionate about because I myself am an advocate for human rights, especially for people with disabilities. But I've noticed that a lot of human rights movements often exclude people with disabilities. Now, I think most of this is unintentional. I don't think their intentions are malicious. I think it's just they're not considering the needs of people with disabilities, um, just because there might be some lack of understanding and education there. So I kind of want to talk a little bit about that and some of the ways that these human rights movements can be more inclusive for people with disabilities. Um, there's a lot of human rights movements out there that focus on things like gender equality or marriage equality or racial equality. And these are all very, very important causes that I am a supporter of. The problem is they often exclude people with disabilities. And again, like I said, I don't think this is intentional, but it does happen. Because the fact is, there are women with disabilities, and there are people who are gay or transgender who also have disabilities, and there are visible minorities with disabilities. So they should be included in these movements. And there's a number of things that, very simple things that I think can be done to actually make these movements much more inclusive for people with disabilities. And, you know, this isn't always the case. You know, some of these movements are very inclusive, even for people with disabilities. And if you're someone who's organizing a movement like that and it is very inclusive to people with disabilities, kudos to you. Give yourself a pat on the back. Um, and if you're not, then just consider this a learning experience, you know, because I'm sure you're not doing it intentionally. So let's just talk about some of the ways that we can overcome this problem and make the world more inclusive for people with disabilities, especially when it comes to human rights movements. So I recently saw an article, which I'll actually link to in the description below so that you can read, which talks a little bit about this. It's by a woman who herself is a very active advocate for human rights and was recently diagnosed with a disability herself. And she's talking about some of the ways that human rights movements aren't always inclusive for people with disabilities. So, number one is if you're holding a public event or a demonstration, make sure it's accessible. Because if your movement is supposed to be inclusive, but it's not accessible and excludes people with disabilities, then it's not really inclusive, right? So this doesn't just mean having a venue that's accessible. It also means having accommodations, you know, accommodating for people with disabilities, right? So it could mean an accessible washroom. It could mean having an interpreter or cart services for people who are um, deaf or hard of hearing. It could be having braille and large print for people who are blind or visually impaired. Um, and just things like that, right? It could mean making accommodations for people with intellectual disabilities, and things like that, people with autism spectrum disorders. Just not only making sure that the venue is accessible, but making sure that you're accommodating for everyone regardless of what their needs are, right? Because everybody should be included. So that's the first thing to remember. The second thing is to not shame someone for not using alternative transportation. Um, because, especially for people who are trying to be very environmentally friendly, alternative transportation, so we're talking environmentally friendly modes of transportation, um, are something that they tend to be big supporters of. And I understand because, transportation, cars can be bad for the environment, and you want to help the environment. But for people with disabilities, they don't always have access to alternative transportation. So, for example, someone with a disability can't always, may be unable to walk or bike to places. And ride sharing services such as Uber or Lyft and also taxis aren't always accessible. And then as for mass transit doesn't always accommodate for people with disabilities. And even when it does, it's usually not available to people in rural areas, right? So because of that, people with disabilities tend to rely on their own forms of transportation if they're lucky enough to have access to that. Um, so alternative transportation isn't always an option for people with disabilities. And then the next thing is shaming people for having a disability who don't look like they're disabled. We've talked about how, on this series many times, about how not all disabilities are visible, right? So just because someone doesn't look disabled doesn't mean they're not disabled. So don't shame someone because they don't fit your idea of what disability looks like. Just because someone doesn't use a wheelchair or have a white cane or use a walker or have a service dog, that doesn't mean that they're not disabled. It just means that they have a disability that is less visible. So please keep that in mind and don't, shame people for faking their disability, because odds are if someone says they have a disability, even if they don't look disabled, guarantee you they're disabled. It's just not a very visible disability. And then that brings me to the last thing, which is acting like public demonstrations. So we're talking about like marches and sit-ins and things like that are the ultimate form of advocacy. Because for a lot of people with disabilities, they're unable to participate in these events for a number of reasons. Maybe there's physical limitations that prevent them from participating in an event like that, and maybe it's other considerations that they have to think about. But there could be a reason why they can't participate in that kind of event, right? It doesn't mean that they're not as good of an advocate. It just means that their toolbox is different than yours. So instead of using a hammer and nails to get the job done, they might use a screwdriver and screws. They're doing the job differently, but they're still doing the job. So they might not be able to attend those events, certain people with disabilities, but that doesn't mean that they can't advocate in other ways. So just really be mindful of that and be supportive of them. So that's just some of the ways that we can make these events and human rights movements more accessible for people with disabilities and more inclusive for them. Because like I said, if your human rights movement is meant to be inclusive, which they typically are, but it's not accessible, then it's not really inclusive. And again, this isn't me blaming anyone. This is just me trying to educate everyone about how we can do a better job. And if you are already doing these things, then give yourself a pat on the back because you're doing excellent. So, like I said, I'm going to include a link to the article in the description below, so be sure to read that. It's a very informative article. And if you enjoyed this video, be sure to subscribe and share the video with your friends. And also be sure to like us on Facebook and follow us on Twitter and Instagram as well, because we are also on Instagram. Anyway, thanks for watching and see you next week.